Cersei Lannister is indisputably one of the most important characters in the world of Ice and Fire. Her actions have already radically changed the history of the Seven Kingdoms. She is arguably the most consistent and important antagonist throughout the mainline series. And if Game of Thrones is any indication, she will continue to be so until the very end. But if Cersei is the most influential villain in the books, then why don't the books treat her that way? House Lannister and House Stark are positioned as rivals from Book 1, and Tywin and his children are not only the driving forces behind the near downfall of House Stark, but they are the architects of many acts that have completely changed the face of Westeros. And, while their political talents may sometimes be overblown, House Lannister has managed to stay in the highest position of power outside of the Iron Throne during 2 rival reigns, during both Aerys Targaryen's rule and Robert Baratheon's. Early on in the story itself, the Lannisters have taken control over the Seven Kingdoms in all but name. Individually, Tywin, Tyrion, Jaime, and Cersei have all made multiple choices that have literally changed the course of Westerosi history as it's happened. From a metatextual standpoint, Tyrion is clearly an author and fan favorite. Tywin is widely considered to be the savviest politician in the contemporary storyline, if not the entire history of Westeros. And Jaime Lannister is seen as a redeemable character despite attempted child murder. But, while she may have her own supporters, none of this can really be said for Cersei. And an interesting question is, why? More specifically, is it simply because she's not as interesting or sympathetic as a character, or is it by design? Because obviously, point of view is one of the most vital elements of A Song of Ice and Fire, and it's a storytelling device that George R.R. Martin takes advantage of to great effect. Tyrion is admittedly his favorite character, and that is reflected in the positive reader reaction to his character despite his many flaws. Similarly, while the author can't control how the audience reacts to any specific character, the use of point of view as a narrative tool makes influencing a character's image considerably easier. And with that in mind, Cersei's lack of perspective for the majority of the story is an incredibly interesting narrative choice. As we've seen throughout the books, a character's point of view can be introduced at any time. But considering that Cersei is insanely influential on the story from Book 1, where she literally orchestrates the murder of the king, usurps the throne for Joffrey, and is indirectly responsible for Ned Stark's death, the absence of her point of view up until A Feast for Crows seems like an incredibly intentional and meaningful choice. When looking at Cersei's role in the story from a bird's eye point of view, one of the most obvious questions is, why now? Why didn't Cersei warrant her own point of view chapters earlier on in the tale? And what makes her perspective essential when it is finally introduced? Obviously, it could just be written off as plot necessity. There are things going on in King's Landing that the audience needs to be aware of, and there aren't any POV characters who can provide that. Therefore, Cersei gets her own chapters. However, it seems like there should be more to it than that. Again, Cersei has been a major player from the very beginning. So the lack of insight into her interior drama at the start of the series, and the introduction to her internal experiences immediately after the death of Tywin Lannister, of all people, seems more intentional and meaningful than just ensuring that there are a pair of eyes showing us what's happening in King's Landing. One of the things that sticks out the most about Cersei's POV introduction in A Feast for Crows is that simply, we begin seeing inside Cersei's mind when she's at her rock bottom. It's after the murder of Joffrey and Tywin, both of whom she believes were killed by Tyrion, which in her mind would have rightfully caused her consistent paranoia about his intentions towards her to absolutely explode. She is now essentially alone, or at least she feels alone, in King's Landing with Tommen, surrounded by people that she mistrusts and who actually are out to get her in many instances. And unbeknownst to her, literally the only living person left that she trusts, Jaime, has basically abandoned her. So I think this says something interesting about the way in which we're meant to perceive her as readers. We only get to see the buildup of her madness and villainy from an external point of view. And when we finally do get a glimpse inside of her mind, it's when she has already devolved into the worst version of herself. Now, all of this isn't to say that Cersei isn't a villain. However, the contrast between how she is perceived in comparison to the broader audience reaction to similarly villainous characters who have had a longer point of view story arc feels relevant. And therefore, the absence of Cersei's build-up towards villainy seems intentional. For instance, look at how Cersei is seen in comparison to the general interpretation of Tyrion and Jaime. Interestingly, Cersei is often seen as the odd one out when it comes to House Lannister, either because she's not smart enough or not redeemable enough to truly represent her family, when in reality that doesn't seem to be true. Tyrion is undoubtedly an antagonistic character who has no problem killing people for his own convenience, and he is just as vengeful and casually cruel as Cersei is on her worst day. Jaime is an attempted child murderer who doesn't understand why the world doesn't give him the respect that he's due, just like Cersei. And Tywin is mercurial, prideful, easily wounded, and is willing to engage in any brutality in order to win power or prestige. Frankly, Cersei is a near picture-perfect representation of her nuclear family, and ironically, she is absolutely Tywin's heir and legacy, just not in the way that she presumes. But unsurprisingly, Cersei gets far less sympathy than Tyrion and Jaime do, and that can at least partially be attributed to the fact that Tyrion and Jaime spend so much time thinking about how misunderstood they are and how much they want to be better, even if their decisions and actions do not reflect that whatsoever. Tyrion has more POV chapters than any other character in the series so far, and his overall image as a misunderstood underdog is undoubtedly formed because of how much he sees himself that way. He is incredibly self-pitying, and even when he does something horrible, we can at least see his rationale, regardless of how screwed up it may be. But if we spent most of the book looking at Tyrion from an outsider's perspective, and were then dropped into his mind when he's at his most dangerous and disturbed, he would probably seem like an evil idiot. Jaime's point of view has also been somewhat restricted, but interestingly, it seems to be in the exact opposite way to Cersei. Jaime was arguably his worst self in the early installments of the books, and in A Storm of Swords, when he becomes a POV character, he's going through an insane comeuppance and is finally trying to regain some honor and dignity. And let's be clear, I still think Jaime is an irredeemable character who will threaten to use a baby as a cannonball in order to get his way. But in terms of character development, it's interesting that we start getting to know Jaime when he's trying to do something remotely good with his life after years of apathy and cruelty. Cersei, on the other hand, is not becoming more sympathetic by the time we get to A Feast for Crows. She has already built up an enormous amount of ill will as a character because all we've really seen her do is torture and murder beloved protagonists while she enables and supports the worst of villains. She is a character with plenty of faults, and everything that she has gone through in her recent history has exacerbated those faults to their greatest extremes. So her POV introduction largely takes everything that we're not supposed to like about Cersei and makes it even more intense and unlikable. Therefore, the interpretation of Cersei as an aberration of a Lannister, someone who is not as smart as Tywin, not as redeemable as Jaime, and not as sympathetic as Tyrion, is driven more by narrative trickery than the actual narrative. Cersei isn't any more likely to have someone brutally killed for her own convenience, or any more likely to lash out at someone she feels justifiably or unjustifiably offended by. We just see her behavior differently because we've been manipulated into perceiving it differently. In that same vein, one of the most interesting misunderstandings of Cersei as a character is that she's not smart, or that she's not nearly as smart as she thinks she is. And yes, she has undeniably made catastrophic mistakes. But again, they aren't that much worse than the many dumb decisions that her siblings have made that have also yielded cataclysmically terrible results. Clearly, Cersei going after Margaery using the Faith, only to have that backfire and wind up getting herself arrested, was an obviously stupid decision that is going to have huge implications for her future and the future of House Lannister. But it's not an exceptionally bad choice in comparison to Jaime attempting to kill Bran and starting a civil war, or in comparison to Tywin teaming up with the Boltons and Freys to end that war, or in comparison to Tyrion likely joining Daenerys' invasion of Westeros. Every one of the Lannisters has made terrible decisions that will contribute to the downfall of their family and will result in horrific consequences for thousands of people. And every one of them lets their own personal hang-ups and obsessions influence those terrible decisions. But Cersei seems to be pretty uniquely considered inherently stupid as a result of making those bad decisions. What's also interesting about Cersei is that yes, she lets her obsessions and fears about the younger, more beautiful queen and the Valonqar guide her towards some wild choices that only make her situation worse. But beyond her particular flaws and fixations, Cersei's natural intelligence and instincts are actually pretty good. But ironically, because so many people around her don't respect her or think that she's smart enough to lead, her instincts and intelligence ultimately go to waste. For instance, many people rightfully criticize her for choosing a terrible small council. However, she isn't exactly spoiled for choice, and she doesn't actually get the counselors that she wants. She asks her uncle Kevin to become Hand, but he refuses. Kevin ultimately comes back after Cersei's arrest and takes over. And ironically, Varys winds up assassinating him because he'd be too good at the job. So Cersei's actual decision-making is oftentimes not the problem. It's that she doesn't have the same level of respect or fear that her father and brothers do, so she doesn't actually get what she wants or asks for. But truly, the pièce de résistance that irrefutably proves that Cersei can politically and intellectually rival nearly anyone in the game is the way in which she handled Robert Baratheon. Sure, her plan wasn't flawless and didn't go off without a hitch. But in a story where dozens, if not hundreds of people are obsessed with assassinating a ruler, Cersei managed to single-handedly come up with a plan that successfully killed the king and gave her plausible deniability for his death in a matter of hours. Only Euron Greyjoy can even come close to the king assassinating efficiency that Cersei has. But beyond her greatest hits, Cersei is generally one of the most underestimated characters in the series, both because she's often sharper than she seems, and because the people around her have such a low opinion of her that it's borderline impossible for her not to exceed expectations. And in that sense, her bitterness about the lack of respect that she gets is actually entirely fair. Yes, there are better, smarter politicians than her, but there are also far worse than her too. Her desire for power may make her a bit of a nightmare, but she's also not wrong that she needs it. The Lannisters are in a constantly precarious position, and despite the fact that she has ascended to the highest status a woman can have in Westeros, she's still treated outrageously disrespectfully by the people around her. And as her arrest by the Faith demonstrates, she really can't depend on anyone besides herself, so her desperate grasping for control is actually pretty reasonable. It's interesting, because one of Cersei's least appealing qualities is that she's aggressively misogynistic. She dislikes almost all other women and thinks of herself as superior to them. But something that is pretty hard to avoid is that Cersei is actually treated appallingly by many of the people around her, and her womanhood seems to be a driving force behind a lot of the mistreatment and dismissiveness that she's subjected to. Cersei's misogyny was undoubtedly fueled by her upbringing. She is repeatedly frustrated by Jaime's better treatment, and her lack of a political education seems to be a sore point for her and can only really be explained by Tywin's sexism. Interestingly, Cersei is pretty observant of Tywin's political actions, but a lot of her biggest mistakes seem to stem from the fact that she was observing what was happening rather than being taught why it was happening. So even though she wanted to learn, she wound up deducing the wrong lessons. Game of Thrones did Cersei a massive disservice by having Tywin directly state that Cersei's gender wasn't the reason behind his disrespect toward her, because it's very hard to imagine a world where that has no impact whatsoever. I mean, Tywin outright despises Tyrion, and yet Tyrion has clearly received an exceptional education. Cersei actually wanted to be taught and included in her family's political maneuvering. And despite the fact that Tywin had been planning on Cersei eventually becoming queen since she was born, she was still not given the kind of education that would have made her a much better tool in House Lannister's political tool belt. Given that teaching her to be a manipulative, politically astute queen would have been extremely beneficial for her and Tywin, the question obviously becomes why she was raised as little more than chattel. And the only real answer seems to be that he had no respect for women outside of maybe Joanna. The introduction of Cersei's point of view offers some interesting insight into this as well. The men around her actually do treat her terribly, starting with Jaime. After their father's death, he is the first person she asks to become Hand, and he doesn't hesitate to turn her down and humiliate her in front of a bunch of people that she outranks. Her uncle Kevin is her second choice, but he only agrees to take over as Hand if Cersei gives up her regency, allows Kevin to become regent, and leaves Tommen in King's Landing with him so she can go back to Casterly Rock. It goes without saying, this is a pretty outrageous ask from someone who acknowledges that Cersei outranks him both as Queen Regent and the Lady of Casterly Rock. And to add insult to injury, he takes over the gig and becomes regent anyway when Cersei is arrested. Even someone as low on the totem pole as Osney Kettleblack has no qualms about aggressively demanding sexual favors from Cersei when he wants them. So suffice it to say, it's hard to find a man in Cersei's orbit who treats her remotely respectfully. And, given how we've seen Lannister men in particular treat her, it seems safe to assume that she was raised with this kind of disrespect and internalized it in the worst way possible. Clearly, that doesn't excuse her violent sexism, but it certainly explains a lot of it. Ultimately, Cersei Lannister is an incredibly flawed character, an obvious antagonist, and someone who makes the wrong decision more often than the right one. But there are many reasons why she became the person that she is, and her point of view was introduced into the story after she had already become the villain. It would be interesting to gain some insight into who Cersei was before she hit her rock bottom, but given what kind of people her brothers became, it seems like a near guarantee that she would be who she is now. However, Cersei is more similar to Tywin, Tyrion, and Jaime than she is different, and the perception of her as an irredeemable idiot is only a matter of perspective. But what do you think? Is Cersei misunderstood, and does the absence of her point of view guide how the audience sees her? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.